The room smelled like champagne and legacy. Crystal chandeliers cast golden reflections over polished speeches and decades-old photos. People were laughing, hugging, sipping wine from stemmed glasses. My father's retirement party looked like something out of a political memoir, decorated with pride, carefully edited memories, and selective amnesia. And yet, in the middle of all that curated perfection, I stood, somehow misplaced, like an ink smudge on a resume. He saw me. Of course he did. My father never missed a single detail when it came to appearances. His eyes swept the crowd with the authority of a general, but when they landed on me, something cold shifted in them. I should have known, right then. I was a guest at my own father's farewell. He clinked his spoon against his glass with that signature mix of command and charm. The room quieted, cameras pointed. He stood tall behind the microphone, his voice smooth and confident, as if rehearsed for weeks. I want to thank everyone here tonight. Each one of you has played a role in my career, my journey. I'm proud of the legacy I leave behind. Applause. But tonight is not just about me. It's also about family. I felt a lump rise in my throat. My husband gently squeezed my hand under the table. My father continued. I want to take this moment to express gratitude for the people who truly stood by me. My beautiful wife, my loyal son Nathan, and of course, the colleagues who have become like sons to me. A few polite chuckles. Then, without looking in my direction, he added, and to those who no longer align with the values of this family, I wish you well, but from today onward, please consider this chapter closed. Silence. At first, people didn't register what had just happened. Some thought it was a metaphor, but the look he gave me said otherwise. He wasn't being poetic, he was disowning me. Right there, in front of nearly 200 people, with a smile. I opened my mouth to speak, but the air turned to iron in my lungs. The room blurred. Conversations resumed hesitantly, as if everyone silently agreed to pretend they didn't hear what they just heard. I stood up slowly. My husband stood with me. Don't, I whispered. But he didn't move. His jaw clenched, eyes locked onto my father like a fuse waiting to catch flame. My legs trembled as I turned to leave. Every step toward the door felt like walking barefoot across glass made of childhood memories. The hallway outside felt colder than it should have, like the air had been stripped of oxygen. That night was supposed to be his celebration. Instead, it became my funeral. The version of me he had sculpted and shelved, the daughter who didn't make the cut for his public image, died that night. Or maybe she finally stopped trying to live. I didn't cry, I didn't shout, but I promised myself something as I stared into the darkened parking lot. He may have erased me from his story, but he had no idea how mine was about to begin. People assume that if your dad wears a tie to breakfast and signs autographs at the country club, then your childhood must have been wrapped in satin. Mine was wrapped in silence. My earliest memory of him isn't a hug or a bedtime story. It's the way he straightened his cufflinks while I cried in the hallway after falling off my bike. He didn't look at me, he just said, "Don't bleed on the carpet." I was 7. Growing up, I learned quickly that my father believed in results, not affection. Report cards were the only acceptable currency of love. A B was a personal offense. Creative writing, a waste of time. He told me once, books don't build empires, balance sheets do. So I buried that side of me, the side that wanted to be a storyteller, not a strategist. I learned to smile when he boasted about Nathan, my younger brother, who wanted to follow in Dad's footsteps, who worshipped the stock market like it was scripture. Nathan got weekend mentoring sessions and shoulder pats. I got silence. At 17, I won first place in a statewide essay competition. I wrote about children who felt invisible in their own homes. I left the trophy on the kitchen counter, wrapped in the article with my name in bold print. He never mentioned it. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need his approval. But the truth, every silence from him felt like erasure, like a part of me was being crossed out without explanation. When I left for college, I chose a campus far away, not for the program, not for the climate, but for the distance. I needed to know if I could breathe when his voice wasn't echoing in every room of my head. I could, but healing wasn't linear. Some days, I aced my classes and felt invincible. Other days, I sat in the back of the lecture hall, wondering if he'd even notice if I disappeared. I called home less and less. Not out of spite, out of self-preservation. Mom filled the void with generic updates. Your father's very busy. Nathan just got his internship. And always ending with, you should call more. I wanted to scream, why should I chase silence? But I didn't. Instead, I chased success in my own quiet way. I worked night shifts. I started a blog under a pen name. It gained traction, readers, offers, even sponsorships. It was my voice, finally heard, but no one in my family knew, especially not him. It was during one of those late-night writing sessions in the campus library that I met Ben, my husband now. He saw through my guarded sarcasm and asked questions no one else ever had. What do you actually want? What would you write if no one could read it but you? Whose permission are you still waiting for? I didn't have answers then. But over time, Ben helped me find them. Still, when we got engaged, I hesitated to tell my family. I already knew the narrative in my father's mind. Ben wasn't from the right background. Not enough pedigree, not enough polish. My father shook his hand like he was evaluating a rental car. He didn't object openly. But I saw it in the way he looked past Ben in conversations, the way he called him your friend at the rehearsal dinner. I thought, maybe with time. But time, it turns out, only calcified his opinions. So I stopped hoping. I built a life around the silence, like ivy growing around stone. And in that silence, I learned to raise my own voice. But nothing prepared me for that night. The night he would weaponize that silence into something public, cruel, final. I always thought the worst he could do was ignore me. I never imagined he'd erase me. For a long time, my life felt like a secret. Not in the romantic, mysterious way novels describe, but in the quiet, clenched kind of way. Like keeping your hands balled in your pockets on a freezing day, refusing to admit you're cold. After graduation, while Nathan went on to join one of Dad's investment firms, I did something unthinkable by family standards. I started freelancing full-time. Writing, branding, copy, storytelling, anything that let me use words instead of numbers. I didn't tell them. Every time I tried, I imagined Dad's voice slicing through the room. So, you're a blogger now? How adorable. So I kept it to myself. And the strange thing is, the quieter I stayed, the louder my success became. By 27, I had a team, a growing agency, a client list that included tech startups, health brands, even a few public speakers. My words helped launch campaigns, shape reputations, even rescue a company's reputation after a scandal. But my proudest project? The nonprofit campaigns, the ones that didn't pay much but meant something. Like the online resource center for women rebuilding their lives after abuse, or the campaign for teen mental health awareness. Still, I told no one in my family. Part of me hoped they'd stumble upon it and finally see me. They never did. But he did. Ben. Ben had been reading my blog for 6 months before we officially met. He told me later that my piece, titled "Permission Not Required," made him stop scrolling and start thinking. I knew the woman who wrote that, he said, even before I met her. We met at a guest lecture I almost skipped. I was exhausted, overworked, numb, but something told me to show up. And there he was, sitting 2 rows ahead, asking the kind of questions professors don't expect students to ask. After class, he turned around, smiled, and said, "You're the only one who laughed at the professor's fake joke." I smiled back. That was it. The beginning. Ben was different. Not flashy, not arrogant. He listened the way most people talk, eagerly, intentionally. He didn't try to fix me. He just stood beside me as I did it myself. And he never, not once, questioned the worth of what I did. In fact, he treated it like it was sacred. Once, after a long night finishing a brand overhaul for a domestic violence shelter, I sat at our tiny kitchen table, hair in a bun, bags under my eyes, barely able to keep my head up. Ben handed me a mug of tea and whispered, "You make the invisible visible. That's more power than your dad ever held in a boardroom." I cried that night. Silently. The way I always had. But this time, it was because someone saw me. Really saw me. The first time I brought Ben to meet my parents, I should have known. My father shook his hand, stiff and polite, and within 2 minutes launched into a conversation with someone else. My mom kept glancing nervously between us, as if waiting for me to apologize for my choice. Later that evening, Ben looked at me and said, "I'm sorry." I asked, "For what?" "For how they treated you. For how they couldn't see what I see." I wanted to shrug it off, to play the cool, unaffected daughter. But my silence told him everything. That night, we made a vow. Not just about love, but about truth. We wouldn't hide, we wouldn't perform, so we didn't. We built our life on truth, even if it meant cutting ties. And slowly, I stopped showing up to family brunches where I was always the extra chair. I stopped sending holiday updates into the void. I stopped begging for scraps of acknowledgement. But despite all the peace Ben brought into my life, I never truly healed that daughter-sized wound. Not until the night my father used a microphone to publicly cut me out like a cancer. And Ben? He didn't just stand beside me that night. He stood up. I used to think my father hated Ben because he wasn't born into money, or because he didn't use words like synergy or margin ratio in casual conversation. Or maybe because Ben never tried to impress him, never played that exhausting game of prove your worth like so many others in my father's orbit. But I was wrong. The truth was older, sharper, and much, much darker. It came to light 2 months before the retirement party when I stumbled upon a box while reorganizing our storage room. It was one of those unassuming cardboard lids labeled in faded pen, Taxes 2004. The kind of thing you'd toss without thinking. I almost did, but something, call it instinct or maybe decades of emotional hypervigilance, made me lift the lid. Inside, files, receipts, emails, mostly boring, except one folder labeled Internal Memo, Department Transfer, Benjamin Wells. I froze. At the top of the first page was a familiar logo, my father's old firm. At the bottom, my husband's name. I read every page, every line. The timeline didn't lie. Ben was a junior compliance officer back then, fresh out of grad school, young, principled, probably a little too brave for his own good. He had flagged irregularities in 3 internal reports: shell companies, suspicious account movements, something about pension fund misallocations. And the name at the center of it? My father's. Ben had written a formal report, following protocol, but instead of an investigation he was quietly transferred to a different department. The file described it as a mutual agreement to preserve harmony. Ben never told me. That night I confronted him. I held up the folder with both hands like it weighed 100 pounds. Is this why? I asked. Is this why he's always hated you? He looked at the folder for a long moment, then sat down. Quiet. Steady. Yes, he said. But it's not why I married you. I felt like the floor shifted beneath me. He explained everything. How he'd once admired my father, how disillusionment came fast, how his report was swept under the rug, how he'd learned the rules of survival in high finance. Don't question power if you want to keep your seat at the table. But Ben had questioned it, and paid the price. I never told you, he said, because I didn't want you to hate your father through my eyes. I wanted you to come to your own truth, in your own time. I cried then, not because I hated my father, but because deep down, I had always known. Something wasn't right. That coldness in his eyes wasn't just disappointment, it was fear. Fear that I'd married the one person who knew the cracks in his empire. And maybe I had. But I didn't marry Ben to expose my father. I married him because for the first time in my life I felt safe to be me. Still, now I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't untangle the threads anymore. Every icy remark, every dismissive glance, every calculated insult at family dinners, it wasn't just about disapproval, it was about control. And the fact that he'd lost it the day I chose a man who wouldn't play by his rules. The irony? My father taught me to fear weakness. But Ben had shown me that true strength didn't come from domination or intimidation. It came from integrity, from choosing what's right, even when it cost you everything. So when that microphone passed into Ben's hands that night, it wasn't revenge he held. It was truth. And it was heavy. If you've never been to a high society retirement party, imagine a wedding, but without the love. Just as much glitter, half the sincerity, and triple the political maneuvering. The venue was a luxury hotel ballroom in the city center. Marble floors, velvet curtains, waiters in tuxedos serving cocktails with names I couldn't pronounce. A 4-piece jazz band played in the background, loud enough to be impressive, soft enough not to interrupt the handshakes. And in the center of it all, my father. He wore legacy like a crown that night. Dark, tailored suit, polished shoes, hair groomed with military precision. Every conversation paused when he walked by. Every laugh grew louder in his presence. He wasn't just retiring, he was ascending into myth. And I was an accessory, a +1 with his last name. I hadn't planned to attend. After the discovery in the storage room, after learning the real reason behind his hatred for Ben, I wanted to stay home, eat takeout, and never speak to him again. But Ben insisted. "He'll expect you to stay away," he said. "Let's not give him the satisfaction." I didn't want to face him, but I also didn't want to run anymore. So I showed up. I wore a navy blue dress, not too flashy but sharp enough to make a statement. Ben wore the same charcoal gray suit he wore on our wedding day. Not because we couldn't afford another, but because he said it reminded him of vows that actually meant something. We slipped in quietly and stayed toward the back. I avoided eye contact with anyone who shared my blood. My mom smiled briefly, then looked away. Nathan waved half-heartedly. A few distant relatives gave me polite nods, unsure which side of the invisible line I stood on now. Then came the moment. My father stood to speak. His voice, as always, was perfect. Smooth, calculated, trained over decades of board meetings and press conferences. He thanked the usual suspects, recounted humble beginnings, despite having started with more capital than most people earn in a lifetime. He spoke of hard work, integrity, sacrifice. I felt Ben tense beside me, because we both knew those weren't just omissions, they were lies. But we stayed quiet, until he looked right at me, and decided to make it personal. "And to those who don't reflect this family's core values," he said, raising his glass, "we wish them the best, on their separate journey." People clapped, not because they understood, but because clapping is what you do when someone raises a glass. It's autopilot. But I understood. He had just excommunicated me, publicly, without a single word spoken to my face. Ben stood. At first I thought he was just pulling out my chair so I could leave, but then he reached for a microphone. One of the AV staff must have assumed he was part of the speech lineup. No one stopped him. I grabbed his sleeve. "Ben, please, don't." But he just looked at me, calm, steady, and said, "You don't need to fight anymore, I've got this." My heart beat so loud I couldn't hear the room anymore, just the ringing in my ears, just the ache behind my eyes. He walked up to the stage, alone with nothing but his voice and the truth. My father's expression didn't change, but I saw it, that flicker, that moment of "oh no." The room fell silent again, not out of respect but confusion. Whispers buzzed at the edges. "Who is he? Is he the son-in-law? What's going on?" Ben cleared his throat. "My name is Benjamin Wells. I'm proud to be married to the woman your host has just disowned." Some people laughed nervously, others just stared. He continued. "And since tonight seems to be about legacy, about integrity, I thought I'd share a few things that didn't make it into the brochure." I looked at my father then, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear on his face. It was subtle, a tiny crack in his perfect mask. But I saw it. Because the one thing more fragile than power is the illusion that built it. Ben had never been one for theatrics. He wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice to prove a point. He believed in calm words and steady facts. But that night, with the weight of silence stretching between clinks of glass and awkward coughs, his voice cut sharper than any accusation. "I used to work at Garrick & Rowe," Ben began, nodding to the familiar name etched in gold on the room's souvenir programs, the firm my father had built, worshipped, and wielded like a scepter. "I was a compliance analyst, maybe a small cog in the machine, but I paid attention." My father didn't move. His arms were crossed, his lips drawn into a tight, practiced smile, the same one I'd seen him use at tense board meetings and unwanted family photos, but his eyes were locked on Ben. Calculating. Ben continued. "In 2004 I filed a report. There were discrepancies in 3 internal accounts. Money was moving in ways that violated federal policy. I submitted it through the proper channels." He paused, and then, the report disappeared. The room shifted, like air being sucked out of a sealed jar. You could feel it. Discomfort. Curiosity. The electric tension of a truth too big to ignore. Ben looked directly at my father. 2 weeks later I was transferred to a silent desk job in a department that didn't exist a month prior. No explanation, just a memo signed by someone no longer with the company. Somewhere in the crowd, someone cleared their throat. Another whispered, "Is this real?" Ben nodded toward me. "And years later I met her. I didn't know she was his daughter. I just knew she had fire in her voice and sadness behind her smile. She didn't talk about her family, she didn't need to. Her silence said enough." My knees were shaking. My fingers were locked together so tightly they ached. Part of me wanted to run. Another part, stronger, wanted to watch him fall. Ben's voice grew quieter, but every word felt louder. My wife never needed her father's money. She built her career in the shadows of a legacy that never saw her. She created something honest, something lasting. And tonight, this man, he gestured toward my father, chose to erase her in front of all of you. A murmur rippled through the audience. The mood shifted. The applause earlier had been automatic. This silence, it was awake. She's not the one who betrayed this family, Ben said. He did. The word he landed like a stone on glass. By hiding fraud, by retaliating against those who spoke up, by building his empire on half-truths and hollow values, he taught us all something tonight, that power is fragile when it's built on fear. Ben stepped down. No applause, no cheers, just impact. He returned to me, took my hand. It was shaking. I had to, he whispered. He didn't just try to erase you, he tried to rewrite the story. I looked around. Some people avoided my gaze. Others looked stunned. A few nodded. But the one who mattered most? He stood alone near the stage, still holding his champagne glass, the bubbles long gone flat. He didn't yell. He didn't deny. He just watched me with eyes I couldn't read anymore. And for once, I didn't care. Because in that moment, with truth no longer hiding, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not vengeance. Clarity. We didn't stay for dessert. As soon as Ben stepped off that stage, the atmosphere curdled. Polite conversation turned into whispers. Champagne lost its sparkle. A few people tried to act normal, those types who cling to decorum even as the ground shifts beneath them. But it didn't matter. We had said what needed to be said. As we walked out of the ballroom, hand in hand, I felt a strange weight lift. Not like a balloon rising, but like chains finally falling. No applause followed us. No one tried to stop us. Even my mother stayed seated, her eyes fixated on the untouched cake. The night air hit me like clarity. Cool. Still. Honest. No more performance. No more pretending I belonged in a family that saw me as collateral damage. We didn't speak on the ride home. Ben drove with one hand on the wheel and one resting on my leg, warm and steady. I stared out the window and watched the city blur by, a place that once felt like a stage I was never invited to. Tonight, it finally felt like mine. The next morning, my phone buzzed with texts I didn't expect. Some were from cousins I barely remembered. Did that really happen last night? You were so brave. Your husband is a badass. Others were from former clients of my father, now curious about the firm's integrity. I always wondered about those pension figures. Think you could recommend a different agency? But the one text that stood out came from Nathan. Just 4 words. I think I knew. That hurt more than I expected. Because knowing and saying nothing, they're not the same. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and began to write. Not for a client. Not for a campaign. For me. I wrote about daughters who disappear in their father's eyes, about legacies built on silence, about what it means to tell the truth when it costs you everything. And I ended with a line that had lived inside me for years. I'm not missing. I was just never seen. I published it anonymously, but it didn't stay anonymous for long. It went viral. Emails flooded in. Women, men, grown children, estranged siblings, people who had been cut out, shut down, pushed aside, all writing to say, me too. That's when I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Weeks passed. I never heard from my father. Not a call, not a letter, not even a threat. And I didn't need one. He had already lost the only thing he ever truly wanted: control. One morning, while sipping coffee on our tiny balcony, Ben turned to me and said, he tried to erase you. I smiled. Yeah, but you turned the page instead. And just like that, I realized something. Forgiveness wasn't about making peace with him. It was about no longer letting his silence define the volume of my life. So I let go, not to forget but to choose. I chose joy. I chose truth. I chose me. And if you've ever felt erased by a parent, a partner, a world that doesn't see you, know this: you're not ink on someone else's story. You're the author of your own. Now go write your ending. Or better yet, your beginning. If my story struck something in you, if you've ever had to walk out of a room just to reclaim your worth, leave a comment. Share your voice. We weren't meant to stay silent. We were meant to stand up and speak.